Today's tutorial is going to cover the installation of a TrailTech Z400 flywheel. This product spans the fitment of a 2002 to the 2008 models. To begin removal of the Z400 flywheel, we're going to first remove the sprocket cover, shift lever, and starter cover off of the side of the motor. In order to do so, you're going to need a 10mm socket or wrench to remove the shift lever bolts, and you will need an 8mm socket to remove all the case bolts. So to start, we're going to go ahead and loosen up all of the 8mm bolts around the side of the motor. With all the bolts manually loosened, oftentimes a driver such as a Makita drill like this one will speed up the process in removing these bolts. I'm going to go ahead and loosen this cable stay, freeing it from all the cables in the way, and remove the sprocket cover. With that out of the way, take note there's an additional metal bracket as a case saver underneath that will also need to be removed. Having removed both pieces, will now easily expose the top of the 10mm nut holding the shift lever onto the bike. With the shift lever successfully off, we're now free to remove the starter gear cover, making note on which bolt went in which configuration. With those successfully removed, we'll go ahead and remove the cover. This cover should consist of one bushing inside the upper case, a washer on top of the gear, starter gear itself, an additional bushing with a washer as well. Make sure to remove all of these and that they go back in the same configuration upon installation, or the gear will not seat properly in the case. There's one additional 8mm bolt that is exposed by removing the gear in the inner case that will also have to be loosened for removal. Again, making note to keep track of what bolts came from what direction, lay them out accordingly, and remove the side case. Note, with the exposed cavity from the starter gear, oftentimes there will be residual oil. To prevent it from leaking over the ATV when removing the side case, stuff it with a rag. Now, using the lower pry point and the upper pry point, we're going to gradually lift the case, rocking it back and forth to loosen the rubber seal on the starter motor shaft, which does tend to make this a bit tight. For removal of this flywheel, we're going to use an impact air gun. For the tools listed by Suzuki's manufacturer specifications for removal, please reference your owner's service manual. With the nut now loose, we're going to remove it. With the nut now removed, we're ready to remove the flywheel itself. Using the flywheel puller here for the LTZ specific, which can be found at most of your local authorized Suzuki dealers, we're going to thread this down onto the flywheel clockwise, making sure that the exterior portion of the flywheel puller is seated before we thread the interior bolt down onto the crankshaft end. Make sure that's properly seated, or you do risk potentially pulling and tearing the threads on the flywheel upon removal, rendering your stock flywheel useless. Seat the inner bolt to the end of the crank until you feel a firm connection. Once there, give it a good half turn as well. This flywheel puller requires a 19mm socket on the cap to remove the flywheel. Note, it does not take much pressure to pop the flywheel off. Be cautious not to over tighten, potentially risking damage to the crankshaft. Once loosened, you may loosen the inner bolts to relieve tension, and then unthread the flywheel puller from the flywheel itself. Once successfully removed, we're going to lift the flywheel from the motor case, verifying that the woodruff key is in fact still seated in the crankshaft keyway. Now, with the flywheel removed, we're going to proceed by removing all 6 fasteners on the interior of the flywheel, holding the starter clutch to the back of the motor. The starter clutch will bolt onto the back of the TrailTech flywheel you've purchased and will retain the stock component. In order to do so, you will need an M5 hex socket, similar to this one here, and proceed by removing all of these fasteners. With all the fasteners successfully removed, starter clutch should just simply drop off the bottom of the flywheel, leaving all 6 fasteners stuck to the interior wall of the flywheel. These fasteners will need to be kept to reinstall this port on the TrailTech flywheel. Trail Tech flywheel found here should seat and match up directly to the same bolt spacing as the factory flywheel. Note, due to the magnetism on the interior of the flywheel, this tends to be a bit difficult. Installing one bolt at a time and making sure it threads into the starter clutch will help the job along. Alright, now we're going to tighten these fasteners back down, completing the installation. Alright, now successfully installed. Should have a starter clutch on the back side, exposing the bearing that sits over the one-way gear. We're now ready to install the flywheel. Again, making sure the woodruff key lines up to the keyway in the flywheel, we're going to seat the flywheel down onto the crankshaft. Make note that the ring gear will also need to set to this gear assembly in the rear here. Oftentimes, if it's not seating properly, the alignment is just not quite there. By simply adjusting this ring, you can seat that down quite easily. With the flywheel now installed, we're going to install the nut back onto the crank end, making sure to thread this all the way flush to the flywheel surface prior to hitting it with any sort of impact or torque wrench. Today we're going to use an impact gun to tighten this back down. For proper installation and torque specifications for that flywheel nut, please reference your OEM service Suzuki manual. With the flywheel now installed and completely tightened down, we're free to reinstall the side case. In doing so, make sure the stator wires are clear out of the way to avoid pinching when the case goes back on. Again, making sure that your guide pins are properly seated in your side case. Flip the side case back over, lining up your starter motor shaft and stator to the interior diameter of the flywheel. Again, referencing the seal found on the starter shaft motor, this portion would be best installed using the help of a rubber mallet. Gently wrapping on top, seat the upper portion of the case till the starter body is flush interior of the case. Once there, apply pressure evenly over the case, making sure it's properly seated and all dowel pins are in their proper positioning. If this gasket's been removed or installed multiple times, it is highly recommended you replace the side case gasket as well to prevent leaking of oil on the underside of the case, oiling the bottom of the motor. Now with the case seated properly, we're going to reinstall the bolts in the same fashion they came out, making sure that they're all in the appropriate holes. Being smaller threads and to prevent cross-threading, we're going to manually start each one of these by hand, again using an 8mm socket. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and reinstall the starter gear. As described before, there is a washer found on the bottom side, as well as a bushing that will slip over the collar here and slide into the interior case here. Upon installation, to help guide this, since you will be lining up this lower gear portion as well as this upper gear portion here and here, oftentimes resting the bushing halfway seated will help guide this installation. With the gear now seated, we're going to install the final washer and install the cover and reinstall the three 8mm bolts around the exterior of the cover. Again, making sure to tighten these down to factory specified torque specifications. With that now installed, we're going to go ahead and reinstall the case saver. For ease of installation, prior to installing the sprocket cover, reinstalling the shifter while you still have good access to the 10mm bolt tends to make this job go quite a bit easier. With that now installed, we can reinstall the sprocket cover and finish the installation. To help ease installation, I tend to straighten this, allowing it to easily slide underneath the wires. When installed properly, again make sure to align these wires to prevent pinching underneath of the sprocket cover or underneath the side case. Again, we're going to manually start these by hand to ensure that we do not cross-thread these fasteners. With the sprocket cover now successfully installed, we can reinstall the cable stay by wrapping it clockwise back around the wires in the same fashion you took it off. You have now successfully installed a Trail Tech LT Z400 flywheel.